Now we will discuss building global structures. In our previous modules, we have already discussed local structure of discourse as well as the global structure of discourse. Local structure primarily deals with the individual sentences and the understanding of the individual sentences and the meanings conveyed by those individual sentences. And the global structure has more to do with the information that is around the individual, that is beyond the level of individual sentences, which deals with the state of affairs that is there in the world. Now, in terms of developing global structure, we need to understand that they are also considered as the macro structures, and local structures are micro structures. So at the macro structure, we see that a normal language user is unable to retain and recall immediately the information which is given in the individual sentences, or memorize or recall individual sentences. By getting engaged in a process of a discourse, the reader actually, instead of recalling and storing individual sentences, tends to form the understanding of a complete whole, a coherent whole, instead of looking at one sentence at a time. Now, this construction comes out of the interpretation of what the information is saying, and by just looking at the interpretation or forming interpretation, when the reader constructs a macro structure, this helps him or her to reduce the size of information, which is a complex information, to a manageable size, to develop a schema on which a process of storing or recalling is further based. So, global structure is basically, when we are talking about that, it's the devices that highlight the main points of a passage and that are certainly helpful in short run. But ultimately, we need to identify important points even when they are not explicitly marked. And when they are not explicitly marked and you still develop the understanding, that actually comes from the macro structure or interpretation of the coherent whole. As we become more familiar with the content and structure of an author's prose, we can gradually deduce the author's schema. Then we become in the line of what the author wants to convey, what author wants us to interpret. We will now look at the studies or the experiments that have been done in order to understand the building of global structure. We see that the test which were conducted, and it has been proposed that one good test of whether we have successfully done this is to write summary for a portion of a text. So, in order to build a global structure, you read the details, you look at all the individual sentences that are given in the passage, and after reading it, writing a summary of the text, which means what you have understood. So the summary will not require you to repeat the individual sentences, but rather your understanding and your summing up of the text. Now, this is something that has been proved, that as we become more familiar with the content of this and the structure of the author's writing, then you tend to deduce the author's schema. So this requires us to select specific propositions, which are the specific ideas, as the most important ones, and to generalize some of the individual propositions into broader thematic statements. So you will generalize the individual sentences into broader thematic statements, and that is what was proposed by Fletcher. Now, by comparing our summary with authors, we can see how close we have come to extracting the gist of the text. As we become more proficient, we can shift to a greater reliance on global processing strategies. So individually and then ultimately, that is what we will be able to achieve. Another point is tailoring comprehension activities to test. Now, this was something which was also used, and memory researchers have established, based on tailoring comprehension activities test, that retention is best when we study material in a manner similar to the way we must encode it at the time of the test. Most strategies for improving discourse performance work some but not all of the time. So their success often depends on whether they are appropriate for a particular. So appropriacy for a particular test is important. It's not that an inappropriate or irrelevant information is given in a test and the results are expected. Now, an example is from a study of Mans et al., where the students studied an online or outline of the relevant background information before reading a text. For some students, the organization of the outline was consistent. For others, the outline was inconsistent. As might be expected, consistent outline students performed better on memory for the information in the text. However, the inconsistent outline group showed superior performance on an inference verification task and on a difficult problem-solving task that required a deep understanding of the passage. So this shows that it is not appropriate to say that the presence of a consistent outline improved discourse performance. There could be other aspects also that needs to be measured to see what contributed in the result. So all this shows that there is no one right way to study for a test. The type of studying activity that will be most beneficial will depend on the type of tests that are conducted in order to look at the global structures that contribute to the reading comprehension. For building global structures, we need to consider what aspect of performance is being measured, what we will be asked to do with information before comprehension strategy is decided. That makes sense. To say that the presence of consistent outline alone improved discourse performance is not appropriate.